Okay, so I am gonna change things up. We've talked a lot about global relations and about politics. I'm gonna focus a bit more on cybersecurity in the energy sector specifically. There's a lot of really interesting challenges, really unique challenges that exist in this space. Now, some of you may wonder why someone who works for a media organization is talking about security in the energy sector, part because it's a very new, exciting field. It has some very unique challenges that my role has a lot of unique challenges, this space has a lot of unique challenges, but also cybersecurity is a lot about finding the things that actually matter. Find the things that you need to prioritize, that you need to focus on, and go from there. So, let's see. I'm sure this is pretty familiar to many of you, but I wanted to just make sure that we're on the same page when we talk about the systems that we're trying to protect in this industry. So, we got a lot of industrial control systems, which is just general term for control systems. We're talking SCADA, we're talking other control systems, we're talking logic controllers. Basically, system that you find in critical infrastructure defined as electrical, water, oil, gas, etc. These are things that I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with. But here's where it gets pretty interesting. So I want to do a show of hands. Raise your hand if you have a mobile phone that is more than 5 years old. None. Now in this case, we're talking systems that were designed to last for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. They were not designed to be used by anyone and everyone for a short period of time. We're talking really complex systems with a lot of specialized knowledge designed to work for a very long time. And we're also talking about systems that have a lot of proprietary code. If I walk into an environment that has code written in a programming language that I know, it's going to be easier for me to figure out how to secure it than if I walk into something that has proprietary, very specific functionality that I have not seen before. We're also talking about systems that perhaps were never designed to be put online. So we're now also, in addition to physical threats, physical risks, we're talking about digital risks and digital threats as well. Researchers who work on this space, in addition to encountering the proprietary code, also run into versions of Windows that have never been updated, that you can no longer get software updates for. And I think that we've all gotten accustomed to updating our computers and updating our mobile phones, but how do you update these systems? How do you keep these systems secure? What do you do when you're then trying to put them online? So what I started off talking about earlier was the priorities that I have in my job at the New York Times versus the priorities that you have in this sector. Now, for me, the focus is protecting, I don't necessarily want to say intellectual property, but I do want to say that it's about protecting the journalists, their sources, and their communications, and the information that they're working on. Versus with industrial control systems, your priority is going to be 24/7 operations. You can't just necessarily shut down for an hour, 2 hours, 5 hours to deal with a security issue. In my job, my priority is the confidentiality of the information that I'm dealing with, then the integrity of the systems that we have, and then availability of these systems. For me, it's not necessarily the end of the world if our email goes down for an hour, or if people can't access our websites for some period of time. In this space, in the energy sector specifically, availability is at the top of the list. You can't take your systems offline. We're talking human lives in this case. It's not about whether or not someone can check their email every single minute. We're talking about availability first, confidentiality last. Same with access control. For me, the biggest issue is making sure that the network is secure, versus in the energy sector is perhaps more a focus on the physical space. Has someone managed to get onto the facility that isn't supposed to be there? That is perhaps a bigger threat and a more prioritized issue that you deal with, as opposed to someone who gets into your email. Endpoints versus complex systems. For me, I deal with single laptops. A journalist has an issue with the laptop, I take it and I give them a new one. In the energy sector, specifically talking about industrial control systems, we're talking about really complex systems that you can't just sort of swap out whenever you want to. And at the end of the day, we're also talking about physical harm in this space versus, for me, if a computer in the newsroom has something malicious on it, I swap it out and it's business as usual. That is pretty difficult to achieve if the core portions of your control systems have been compromised. So one of the, I think in the abstract, for my talk, there was sort of a question that popped up about how difficult or how easy is it to attack something in this sector. It wasn't very specific about if that something we're talking about is an email account or if it's a facility. So here's what I wanted to outline. There is something called the ICS cyber kill chain. Now, the term kill chain is just traditionally used to explain how an attack happens from the point the attacker is collecting, gathering information, researching your company, to full-on executing the attack and also being able to reproduce it. Now, there's a pretty interesting paper, I have a link on the next slide, that talks about the ICS cyber kill chain to actually fully and in a very repeatable manner attack an ICS. What are the steps that the attacker would have to go through? So it just talks about the research, the preparation, development, execution of that type of attack. And at the same time, when we're talking about how difficult or how easy is it to attack, we also need to talk about targeted versus non-targeted attacks. I think websites get hit all the time. That seems to be how things go when you're putting something online. But is it targeted or is it just random? So when we're talking about how easy or how difficult is it to attack something, it also becomes very nuanced, because how would you define an attack? The link to the paper that I'm referencing is at the bottom, but if you just Google for ICS cyber kill chain, you'll be able to find it. So this image tries to highlight some of the objectives of an attacker. At the top, we're talking loss of view or loss of control. Your website go down. The portal for your control system is unavailable. The portal where your customers can download certain pieces of software or documentation goes down. Those are all different types of attacks, but they're not necessarily down at the bottom where we're talking of manipulation of safety, manipulation of sensors and instruments. Those are very two different attacks. And getting to the point where you can execute that type of attack are two sort of very different, kill chains, if you want to use that term. So some of it can be relatively easy. If we're just talking about take down someone's website, I would say that is a whole lot easier than getting to the point of being able to manipulate sensors, for example, or take out an entire facility. So there's another slide that talks about the attack difficulty, and you can see that it's easier to compromise the security of an industrial control system than it is to have a successful attack with the option of re-attacking that system. Because we can define the compromise of ICS security in so many different ways, but having a successful attack of the core system itself and being able to reproduce that over and over and over is much, much harder. And I think that looking at these two images really helps when we're trying to have a meaningful conversation about cybersecurity in this space, because it's not about is it difficult or is it easy, it's about what is it that we have, how sensitive is it, how difficult is it to get there, what are the trade-offs that we need to make to secure the technology that we have right now. So I wanted to also quickly talk about some of the very unique challenges that we have in this space. The first one says knowledge gap. So I mentioned earlier that the system we're talking about are designed to last for 20, 30, 40 years. At the same time, the people that have the knowledge of the cybersecurity challenges and the problems and the solutions in this space aren't necessarily as familiar with the systems that they're now trying to protect. So you have people that know the systems, you have people that know cybersecurity, and there's a big gap of knowledge in between. There's a higher number of publicly disclosed bugs than before. So we have gotten to a point where we're seeing more and more control systems go online on the public internet. We're seeing more and more researchers actually look into this and poke around and try and find the different issues, and these people are also then publicly disclosing the things that they find. So it's not that we're necessarily seeing more issues than before, but we're actually having a more public discussion than what we've had in the past. And finally, it also says vendors, attitudes, and lawsuits. If you're familiar with Stuxnet, and there's another one that was dubbed Havex, you'll find that in both cases, the way that the malware made it onto the facility was through a vendor. The vendor was compromised. The vendor was serving malicious version of software updates that the clients were then downloading and putting onto their systems. But right now, when security researchers approach vendors to disclose the things that they find, they're threatened with lawsuits. So we're at a point where to fully actually secure the systems, we need everyone to play along and actually realize that this is a very realistic threat. Let's see, I got 1 minute left. I'll try to be quick. What could possibly go wrong? People frequently think that I can just put this thing online and nothing bad will ever happen. I am not very interesting. My water treatment plant, who could possibly be interested in that? I am not a target, etc., etc. There are now people that have a habit of scanning all of the internet and taking screenshots of what they find. Water treatment plants is definitely one thing, and you've got all sorts of buttons that you can push. At this point, you don't need to compromise a vendor, to compromise the facility, to compromise the control system. You can just go online and you get this fancy GUI with buttons that you can click. So just to quickly jump through the final slide. It's not that ICS networks are hard to secure. They're actually more defensible than traditional IT networks, because even if you get someone's email account, it doesn't mean that you get the facility itself. There's a lot of steps that you need to take to get there, which means that you have a lot of opportunity to put up defenses along the way that make it much more harder for the attacker. We need to start talking about the different scenarios with regards to the energy sector and cybersecurity. We need to talk about the scenarios that could be harmful. Are we talking about email accounts or social media accounts, or are we talking about vendors or something else? And finally, we need to focus on both passive and active defense. I mentioned that people are sort of now, they know they have to update the software on their computers and on their phones, but you also need to have defense in depth. You need to have security as part of every single step of the chain, and you also need to focus on getting humans involved who can keep an eye on the systems and actually do the research that is needed. Thank you.